at the Arts Garage. In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace all the bearings in your Traxxas two-wheel drive Slash. First thing I'd recommend before you even start is printing out the assembly exploded views off the Traxxas website. That way you have it on hand and you can reference it. So that way when you're reassembling everything, you can make sure it's going back the way that it's supposed to. A lot of times if you've got a car or if you bought it used, some of the parts are missing. And so you want to make sure you reference those documents, those assembly views, so that way you can assemble it the way it's supposed to be assembled. And that way you're ensuring the operation of the vehicle is the way it's intended to operate. But anyway, we're going to start with the front end. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to do one side. The other side is going to be the same thing. So there's two bearings located in the steering hub here. So in order to access those, you're going to want to take off your wheels. If you've got the plastic hexes, all you have to do is take a flathead and just kind of work your way out. If you've got metal hexes like I do, undo your screw first and then they'll pop out. And I'd recommend having a little container to put all your parts in, like a bowl or something. I'm using this 3D printed Bulbasaur. That way none of these roll off the table. Next, what you can do is you can pop out the axle, and that should just push straight out. Also, you're gonna have a washer there, so make sure you don't lose that. So just push out the axle just like that. So next, to make it a little easier to access the bearings, what I'd recommend is to undo the nuts holding your camber link and your steering link. Those are 5.5 millimeter. Make sure your screw isn't rotating. Mine isn't. If yours is, put an Allen there and hold it so that way it doesn't rotate. And then you can take off that nut. Same thing here. Make sure your screw isn't rotating. Mine isn't. So if your screw's rotating, just hold back up on it using an Allen and you can take this off. There you go. So now you've got better access to the bearings. Make sure y'all can see this. So since we took those links off, you can actually see the bearings. So the bearing is right here and here. So an easy way to get them out is actually use an Allen, and you can stick your Allen in there kind of angled and catch the inside edge of the bearing, and you should be able to push it out. So once you have one side off, you could use, say, a flathead screwdriver, and that way you've got more coverage and you can get that bearing off. And these bearings are completely shot. Hold on to these bearings. You might be able to refurbish some of them and save money in the long run. I like to have 2 sets of bearings on hand. If I've got a good set of old bearings that I can refurbish, I'll refurbish them, have them in my box, so next time I need to replace everything, I have it ready. I don't have to take them out, clean them, and then put them back in. And if you haven't seen my previous video on how to prep your RC bearings, please check that out. I'll put a card up above so that y'all can check that out for yourselves. Try to clean out any dirt that might be in the plastic, because you want to make sure that you can seat the new bearings in. All right, so I've got my new bearings that I've prepped. I'll need 2 of those. So just install the new bearings, just pop them in just like that. So next, what I like to do is, I like to, like if your axles are, you know, kind of rusted or feel kind of rough, you can clean them and smooth it out. And what I like to use is Never Dull. You can get this at the auto parts store, and I'll see if I can find something like this or comparable that you can get off of Amazon. And this does wonders for your metals. If you got hinge pins, even your suspension shafts, your shock shafts. And so what I like to do is actually get a drill and just lightly chuck up on it. And then be careful when you do this, but all you gotta do is check out the color now. It's kind of rusted looking. And you just take this Never Dull, tear out a piece. And just work it back and forth. You can start seeing that it's starting to get shiny. So this Never Dull will polish up. Remember, you don't want to chuck up too hard because you'll damage those threads. So just go very lightly on the chuck, and then just clamp real hard with your fingers and work it back and forth until it cleans up. So it might still look a little discolored, but to the feel, to your hand, it feels super smooth, and that's what you would want. All right, now we can reinstall this axle. And then reinstall your steering and camber links. Make sure your screw's not spinning. Mine isn't, so I don't need to hold back up, but if yours is, hold back up on it. All right, now you can install your washer. And then your hex pin. And then finally your wheel hex. And if you've got metal hexes, make sure you don't over tighten the small screw, because you don't want to strip it out, because it's going to be a bad day trying to get that wheel hex off. And there you go. Now just repeat that same process on the other side. That'll be it for the front hubs. Next, we can address the steering bell cranks. They have 4 bearings in them. Some models come with those bearings, some do not. So check to make sure if yours does. My original steering bell cranks did not come with them, but since I've upgraded to metal steering bell cranks, they do have bearings, and in the diagrams from Traxxas, it does show bearings. So definitely check those. And in order to get to those 4 bearings, we're going to take off these 5 screws. If you've got the stock bumper, you're gonna have 2 screws that are gonna be kind of located here, and you need to take the bumper off from the bottom, which will be these 4 screws. And then the 5 screws to take after you take the stock bumper off, you have to take off the 5 screws that are located here. In order to make this easier on yourself, I'd recommend unplugging the servo. So go ahead and take off the small cover on the receiver box first, and then take off the large receiver box, which is going to be the 2 screws. Now you can unplug your servo. The servo is going to be plugged into channel 2. So you can unplug that and fish the wire out from the receiver box. And then take it off this tab. And now you can separate the front end from the chassis, and all you have to do is lift up and twist, and then feed your servo wire out this hole. And set your chassis aside. All right, so now we have to take off these 2 screws here and here to remove the steering bell crank. And as you remove the screws, take note of the orientation of the washers. The washers on the high CG chassis and the low CG chassis are different. Low CG chassis has a small washer and a large washer on top, and then a large washer on the bottom of the steering bell crank. Whereas the high CG chassis has 2 washers on the bottom and only 1 small washer on the top. Now, once you have those 2 screws off, you should undo the steering linkage from the servo. So I'd recommend undoing the screw here. The stock one doesn't have a nut on it, but the way mine is set up, I do have a nut on it. So with that screw out and the nut out of the way, you can just pop up the steering bell crank. Might have to turn it a little bit, but that's it. And one of the bearings is stuck on the bottom, on the shaft, so you can remove that. And additionally, say for example, your bearing didn't come off on the bottom, just take an Allen and push through and catch the edge of that bearing, and it should pop off. If the top bearing doesn't want to come off, take an Allen and go through the bottom, catch the edge, and work that bearing out. There we go. I just installed these bearings, so I'm gonna set them aside because I know they're good. And the bearing kit that I linked below came with new bearings for the steering rack, so I'll be using those. Okay, and just pull up the last bearing from the shaft. And now we can install the small bearings that came with the kit. So just put the small bearings on the shaft. I'd recommend doing that rather than trying to install it in the bell crank. Then you can install the bell crank. I'd recommend, what I found easiest is to kind of push the steering to one side, like so, and then kind of, you're gonna have to work it a little bit to get it aligned. And the shaft does flex, so you can kind of push it slightly to line it up, just like that. Make sure your steering bell crank is sitting nicely on your bottom bearings, and then you can install the 2 bearings on top. Just push them down with your nails, and then reinstall the washers on the top as they came off. So mine came off with a large washer and then a small washer on the screw. And then go ahead and tighten down these screws. Remember, you're going into plastic, so you don't need to tighten these down too hard. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna kind of tighten it down until it shoulders up, and then we're gonna check to see if the bearings are too tight. Because if you tighten it too much, which I'm gonna do on purpose, so you can see what happens. So if you tighten it too much, well, the steering doesn't want to move. It's pretty tight. That's going to put a lot of stress on your steering servo. So if you over tightened it, just go back and loosen it up until until the steering moves by itself, just like that. And that's what you want. You want it to move freely under its own weight. So next, we can reinstall the linkage from the servo to the arms. And I'd recommend, if you have a longer screw, to install a longer screw and a nut, so that way it doesn't back out and will give you a little bit more reliability. All right, so if you did the bearings on both sides in the steering blocks, and this, you're done with the front end, and you can reinstall it onto your chassis. So I'll show you how to do that. First things first is take your servo wire and put it through the hole in the chassis for the wire, and then you're going to sadly twist the chassis and stick it through the front tower. And then you're gonna line it up and make sure all the holes line up, and make sure that the bottom, see, I messed up there. I make sure that the bottom is sitting flush right here, and make sure your steering bolts are sitting inside the chassis where they're supposed to. Pull your servo wire through, and now you can reinstall the 5 screws that you took out, and then if you took out your front bumper, you can reinstall those. And then go back and tighten by hand, and remember, you're going into plastic, so you don't need to crank down on it too hard. Once it's shouldered up, you're good. Now we can route your servo wire back into your receiver box. and plug it into channel 2. Next, make sure that there's enough slop in the servo wire, so if the chassis flexes, it doesn't stress the wire out and maybe tear it. And then install your wire onto this tab right here, just like that. And now we can reinstall the covers. Make sure your seal is in place, your wires and antenna are within the receiver box, and then reinstall your screws on the large cover first. Then you can install the small cover. Alright, now you're done with the front end. Now we can move on to the rear end. In order to do the rear end, the easiest way is to actually take the rear end completely off the chassis, and we can have better access to all the bearings in the transmission and the 4 bearings that are going to be located in the rear hubs. There's going to be 2 on this side and 2 on the other side. So let's take the rear end off first, and then that way we'll have more room to work with. So in order to take the rear end off, what I'd recommend is taking off the motor wires from the ESC. And in order to do that, undo this little tie down and set that aside. And then you can unplug your motor wires from the ESC and feed these wires through the hole in the tower. That way it will give you better access to the screws. So next what we're going to do is we're going to take off the 2 screws here and here. Those screws hold the rear end onto the chassis. Next what we're going to do is take off the screws on the bottom. There's going to be 6 screws on the bottom. They're going to be located here. And that'll allow us to remove the rear end. Now all you have to do is rock the back end like so, and then just pull apart just like that. So kind of tilt this back and pull. Now we can set the chassis aside, and we have a lot of room to work with on the rear end. So first what I'll address is the bearings in the rear hub, and then we'll address the bearings in the transmission itself. So in order to get access to the bearings in the rear hub, what I like to do is first off, take your wheels off, then take off your wheel hexes. If you've got metal hexes like I do, you're going to need to take off the screw. If you don't, just use a flathead screwdriver and pop off the hexes just by sticking it in there and twisting. And set aside your hex pin and washer. And unfortunately, I do not have a washer there. So I will have one in my bag, and I'll replace it when I reassemble. Next, what you're gonna do is you're gonna remove this screw, the camber link screw, from the rear hub. So now you should have enough room to pop up the axle just like that. And again, you're gonna take an Allen and just put it in one side and push against the edge of the bearing and slowly push out that bearing. Plastic hub carriers, because they're a bit more flexible, but if you've got aluminum carriers, the bearing might be a bit stuck, so just be patient and be careful when trying to push it out, because you don't want to, have the Allen slip and hit your fingers. So be careful where you put your fingers when you're holding, so that way it doesn't come into the range of an accident. Additionally, I'm just using an Allen bit. You could use, this is one that I rarely ever use, so I'm not too worried about it. And then just hit it with a hammer, or I'm just using a larger Allen to kind of lightly tap it, and it's starting to work its way loose. And the bearing's out. So just set aside the old bearing. I'm going to try to address that later. Then you can stick a flathead or a larger Allen bit like this and just try to push out the other side. And it looks like this one's going to be stubborn as well, so we'll just have to lightly hammer it until it comes out. Now we can reinstall the new bearings and just clean out any dirt that might be in there. And then just take your new bearings and pop them in. And now just reinsert your axle. Sometimes when you do this process, the axle will actually push out the bearing, so just take a note of that. Next, we can reinstall the camber link screw. And then you can reinstall your spacer or washer on your axle. And then your wheel hex. And then if you've got the metal wheel hexes, tighten those screws down. Just make sure that you don't over tighten it, because you don't want to strip the head on that screw. And there you go. Now all you have to do is repeat that process on the other side, and done with the bearings in the hub carriers. So next what we can do is address the bearings in the transmission, and that's a little bit more detailed of a process, so follow along. In order to access the bearings in the transmission, I'd recommend removing the motor. So depending on your pinion size, you may or may not be able to get the motor out. So if you Loctited your pinion, apply some heat to it with a soldering iron and remove the pinion screw. I didn't Loctite mine yet, so I can easily remove mine and remove the pinion, and you can set that aside. Next, we can remove the two screws that hold the motor onto the transmission, and those two screws are here and here. Okay, so with your pinion off and the two screws holding the motor in, you can just slide the motor out just like that. All right, so next what we're gonna do is we're gonna remove the rear bumper, and that's gonna give us better access to removing the rear tower. So in order to remove the rear bumper, you have a few screws that you have to remove. So we're gonna remove this screw here on the spur side, and then we're going to remove this screw and this screw on the motor side. And this is a good time to have that diagram from Traxxas in front of you, because some of these screws are different lengths. So you want to reference those as you reinstall in case you don't take a note of where these go when you set them aside. So these are the 3 screws that came out. On the motor side, you have the medium length screw that went in this hole, the longest screw that went in there, and then you have a short screw that went in on the other side, just like that. So I like to set it aside like that so I remember where they go. Next, we need to remove these 2 screws that are located here and here. And if you've got Proline body mounts or maybe even the stock mounts, those are kind of in the way. So we're going to remove the 4 screws holding on the body mounts located here. And then you can leave the screws in there and set that aside. Now we can take off the 2 screws located here and here. So those 2 screws kind of help hold the transmission halves together. So with those off, what we can do is we need to remove the axles from the transmission, and then I recommend removing the hinge pins from the transmission case as well. So depending on which hinge pins you have, they could be an Allen or they could be a Phillips. Mine are Phillips because that's what they had in the shop. But I believe the only difference is if you have a brushless version, you have hexes, and if you've got the brush version, you have Phillips. But otherwise, you know, the part numbers are the same, or the part numbers are different, but the part itself and the function itself, they're pretty much the same. So if you're in a bind and you can't find the part number that's available, you can always look for the brushed version. So take those hinge pins out. And then next, we can take the pins out from the axles located here. Be careful about these pins because they're small, they're hard to find, and you don't want to lose them. And then once you have the screw out, you can just pull on the axle and it'll come right out. So now we have the transmission. You can set all this aside so you can assemble it later. With the transmission by itself, on the motor side, there's 6 screws that hold the transmission cases together in this manner. So those 6 screws are located here. All the screws are loose. You can separate the 2 transmissions halves by just pulling them apart. So next, just kind of hold on to all your screws while you flip it over, you'll notice that you'll have two bearings here and here. And easiest way to get them out is using a pick. If you don't have a pick, you can probably get away with using the short end of an Allen. The bottom one's going to be easier to take out because there's a hole on the other side. You can just pop it out using a flathead. But this other one, located here, doesn't have a hole on the other side, so you can kind of use an Allen to kind of pry it up, but since I have a pick, I'll be using my pick. I'll try to link some picks in the description below. If you don't have some, you can always go to Harbor Freight and get these picks. They're like $2. But I'm just gonna go ahead and remove the screws and I'll show you all where they go. There's all of them, 4 of them are the same length and 1 is shorter. So I'll tell you which one is the short one when we assemble it together. So just take that pick and just work your way around and slowly pry that bearing off. And since you have the transmission side or open, take a look inside, see if there's anything wrong. I've already taken mine apart and I know there's things wrong with it. So I'm gonna address that in a different video where I build my transmission. But for now, I'll just show you guys how to rebuild the transmission by just using the bearings. So next, the top shaft and the idler gear are supposed to have washers. So take note of that. The differential itself, according to the diagram, does not have any washers. So the way it's now, you can take the diff out and we can set that aside. I can take out the idler gear, and the idler gear is going to have 2 washers, 1 on each side. So you can take those off and set them aside. And then the idler gear has 2 bearings on it. And there's something, check your idler gear, because this is what I found wrong with mine. See if y'all can see this. I'm actually missing teeth. So you can see there, I'm missing part of these teeth here. So I'll be upgrading that in another video. And then the next thing we have to do is take apart the slipper clutch so we can access the bearing that's inside here. So you could take your wheel wrench and hold the shaft gear with your other hand and you should be able to undo that nut. Then you take off your spring and then there should be a washer. And then in the slipper clutch itself, you have a bearing. Then you remove this piece, you have a pin, then you can remove your top shaft, and luckily the bearing came out with mine. So you have a bearing and a washer. So set that washer aside. And now we can take out the last bearing, which is located here. So now to reassemble, we're gonna install a bearing here and where the top shaft goes. And additionally, on the other half we're going to install one there and where the top shaft goes. So the halves are pretty much prepped, so we set those aside. We're going to remove the bearing from the slipper clutch or the spur gear, and easy way to do that is just take a large Allen or a flathead and just pop it out just like that, and then we can install a new one. So that one's ready. Next we need to prepare the idler gear. Alright, so I put some PV blaster on the idler shaft and it finally broke loose. So if yours is in good condition, it should be pretty easy. Just push the idler shaft out and it usually comes out with the bearing. And set that bearing aside and then push it out the other way. And you can take, say, an Allen. The shaft is out. And that bearing's out, and it is nasty. And then you can install your new bearings. Just pop them into place. And then what you can do with this is the same trick that we did on the axle in the front. Just put it in a drill chuck, and then we can use some Never Dull and clean it up. That shaft is much better. And now's a good time to check to make sure that shaft isn't bent or anything. Mine doesn't look bent. Easy way to test it is just put it on a flat surface and roll it and see if it'll roll a lot smoother. Or make sure that it rolls flat and it doesn't wobble or anything. So next, you can insert the idler shaft into the bearings in your idler gear. And that rolls a lot smoother than the ones that we took out. So, and there's no play in it like the one that we took out. So now we can start reassembling the transmission. We've got our two halves and we've got the transmission kind of in some pieces. So you have the side that has the motor mount and the other side. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna start assembling on this side. So let's first install the top shaft. The top shaft, if it doesn't already have the washer on it, make sure you put your washer on it. And then you're gonna stick it through that hole. All right. Now hold it with this finger, turn it over, and make sure you can see the hole for the pin. So take your pin and install it. Just like that. Next, you're gonna take this piece for the slipper clutch and take note because there's a channel for that pin or slot for that pin. So you're gonna install it and make sure that pin sits inside. So when you rotate this side, the gear is gonna spin. Next, install your spur gear and slipper clutch pads. Make sure your slipper clutch pads are still on there. And you're gonna go ahead and install that. Just like that. Next, install your washer, your spring, and then finally your lock nut. And then hold the gear and you can tighten up your spur gear, and you can adjust your spur gear later on, and I'll try to do a video later on how to adjust that spur gear. So now this is assembled. We can continue on assembling the rest of it. So take your idler gear, make sure the bearings are on there, and you're gonna install it into that hole right there. Okay. Next, you can take your differential. The differential has two sides to it. You got the side that has all the gears, and then you have this flat where there's no gear in place. So the way this is going to install is the gears facing the side of the motor plate. If you install it the other way around, like this, you'll see that the gears don't make any contact, so you don't want to do that. Make sure the gears are facing the motor plate, and that way when you turn, say, the spur gear, like so, all the gears are spinning. So now, you can install another washer onto the top shaft and another washer onto the idler gear shaft right there. Now everything inside is complete, and we can put on the other half of the transmission. Make sure your bearings don't fall out, mine are in there, and just carefully line everything up and make sure that you can close the transmission. And once you close it, make sure everything is rotating freely. And now we can reinstall the screws that hold the transmission case together. The screws that hold the transmission case together, there's 6 screws, and there are 5 screws that are the same length and 1 that is shorter. So out of the screws you took out, let's find the short one. So here's the short one. The short one installs in this hole right here. That's the front of the car. So we'll stick that there. And then the other ones are the same length, and they install in these holes here. Okay. And now go back and tighten by hand. Remember, you're going into plastic, so you don't need to crank down on it too hard. Just shoulder it up and it's good. All right, so the transmission is rebuilt. Now, one thing that I'd recommend if you're running in dirty conditions is to put a piece of electrical tape or some duct tape over this hole right here. That way it'll prevent any debris getting inside the transmission and getting into those gears. All right, now we can put this back onto the rear end and then reinstall it onto the chassis. So what we'll do first is we'll install the arms and axles back on. So first thing, what's the easiest way is to install the axles, and make note when you look into these holes on the axles, there's going to be 2 of them, and one side is going to show threads, the other side probably won't show any threads. So make sure that the side that has threads is the one that you're kind of going off of, and all you do is slide on the axle, line it up with that hole that's in there, and then install the pin. And then tighten it by hand, and make sure that you don't over tighten it because it is just threading into plastic. And don't tighten it too tight, just as soon as you feel it shoulder up, that's good. Right. Next we can reinstall the hinge pins. Now we can reinstall these 2 screws that hold the tower onto the transmission. Remember, you're going into plastic, so you don't need to crank down on it too hard. Once it's shouldered up, you're good to go. All right, now we can reinstall the body mounts. And remember, you're going into plastic, so you don't need to crank down on it. Just shoulder it up and it's good. Now what we're gonna do is we're going to install the rear end assembly onto the chassis. And in order to reinstall it on the chassis, since the rear bumper is not in the way, it'll make it easy. You just kind of line it up and it goes into place. So we'll install the top screws first, and the top screws are button head screws. They're gonna look like this. They have a little button head. Remember, you're going into plastic, so you don't need to tighten it down too hard. Just once it's shouldered up, you're good. Now we can reinstall the screws on the bottom. So flip the car over, and you're gonna have 6 screws on the bottom. The larger screws will go in the larger holes located here. They're all the same length. And then your 2 smaller screws that are countersunk will go there. I'll go back and tighten by hand. And since you're going into plastic, you don't need to crank down on it. Just shoulder it up and it's good. Now we can reinstall the rear bumper. And to reinstall the rear bumper, just slide it onto the back and make sure that when you install it, this black piece here slides on to the chassis. Okay. Now you've got 3 screws that install. The longest screw will go in this hole here. Your second longest screw is going to go here. And then your short screw is going to go on the other side right there. So let's tighten those up. And remember, you're going into plastic, so you don't need to tighten it down too hard. As soon as it shoulders up, it's good. All right, now we can install the motor. So take your motor, and the first thing we're gonna do is we're going to pull the wires through the rear tower. Kind of get them out of the way. And then we can install the motor. Make sure y'all can see everything. Take your motor mount screws and go ahead and, I'm going blind here since I can't see, and I'm trying to make sure y'all can see it on the camera. But line up your screw holes. You can see one there. And line up the other one, and then install your screws. And leave it kind of loose for now until you install your pinion gear. Now you can install your pinion gear. And the way I found this is a Traxxas gear, and make sure that you install the screw onto the flat of the motor shaft. So it's flat here. So slide on your pinion gear. Make sure that it's lined up with your spur gear in line. Make sure y'all can see that. You can see that it's in line with my spur gear. And then you can go ahead and tighten down the pinion gear set screw. I'd recommend Loctiting it. I'm not going to do it now because I'm actually going to be taking this apart again. So go ahead and tighten that up. Don't over tighten it because you don't want to strip it. And now you can set your gear mesh, and I'll do another video on how to set the gear mesh. But the way I like to do it is I like to basically push it all the way close. Make sure it's like a really tight mesh, and then I back it off slightly. I'll back it off slightly until I can kind of move the pinion. I'll back it off slightly until I can move the spur gear, just basically wiggle it without the pinion moving at all. So, but I'll do a separate video for that. So once you set your gear mesh, go ahead and tighten down your motor mounts. And then lastly, we can plug in the motor. And Traxxas makes it easy. White to white, blue to blue, yellow to yellow. And then kind of tuck your wires down here, and we can reinstall this clip to hold the wires out of the way. And remember, you're going into plastic, so you don't need to crank down on it too hard. And that's it. We've replaced all the bearings in your car. It should run a lot smoother, especially if you followed my video on how to prep your bearings. Basically clean them out and oil them and get all the grease out that usually comes from the manufacturers of the bearings. And your car should be running a lot smoother. There'll be less stress on your vehicle, on your electronics, and it will probably run a lot faster. So thanks guys for watching. I really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe if you found this helpful. If you got any helpful comments or tips, please leave it down below, not just for me, but for other viewers. And I'll see y'all in the next one. Thanks.